the refugee Bonaparte family reached Toulon to find the terror at its height. As aristocrats, the Bonapartes might have been at risk, but Lucien was already a prominent member of the Toulon Jacobin Club, and the family was penniless, just to be on the safe side. However, Laetitia and her 3 daughters were described on their passports as dressmakers, but Toulon was not secure even for the Jacobins. In July, the townspeople rose against the terror and let in the British under Admiral Hood, forcing Lucien and his fellow politicos to flee. Toulon's action was not an isolated case. In the summer of 1793, the spark of civil war lit up 2/3 of the departments of France. The Girondin faction, expelled from the convention by the Jacobins and men of the Mountain, raised the provinces in revolt against Paris. There was a serious uprising in Lyons, and the defection of Toulon and Marseille conjured visions of a counter-revolutionary link-up with the rebels at Lyons, taking Provence out of the Jacobin orbit. Laetitia initially took lodgings in the small town of La Villette, near Toulon, but when the rising took place, Joseph moved her to Marseille and installed her in 2 rooms there. Desperately hard up, she was forced to queue for soup at the municipal soup kitchen. She eked out an existence on money supplied by Napoleon, who continued to evince a talent for manipulation by rejoining his regiment in Nice and getting 3,000 francs in back pay. He also received additional funds as unofficial secretary to Salisti, who now stood forth as the Bonapartes' doughty champion. Salisti wrote to the convention in Paris, backing the Bonapartes' claim for compensation for their expropriated property in Corsica, alleging that Napoleon had sacrificed all for the revolution. The convention voted a grant of 6,000 francs compensation and notified Joseph, who had gone to Paris to lobby for recompense, but not a penny of the money was ever paid. Napoleon was in favor when rejoining his regiment, partly because the brother of his old friend General Dutheil was in charge. After being employed on the supervision of artillery batteries on the coast, Napoleon 71 was ordered up to Avignon to supervise a convoy bringing powder to the Mediterranean for use by the army of Italy. Napoleon's exact movements in July and August are hard to follow, so it is not clear if he took part in the fighting when Jacobin General Cardo stormed Avignon on the 24th of July. The probability is that he did not. It was while proceeding south through Tarascon and Beaucaire on the 28th of July that he wrote his last major essay, Le Super de Beaucaire. The work is cast in the form of a Socratic dialogue, with an army officer and a Marseille businessman as principals. Also participating are a manufacturer from Montpellier and a citizen of Nimes. The businessman defends the right of Provence to fight Cardo, while the officer castigates the men of the south for plunging France into civil war, arguing that this cannot be justified while France has external enemies to contend with. Napoleon's main point was that the conflict between Girondin and Montagnard was unnecessary, and played the royalists' game for them. The real enemy of both sides were the rebels of the Vendée. Needless to say, the army officer wins the argument, and in gratitude the businessman stays up late and buys him champagne. An unashamed work of propaganda designed to justify the Jacobin position, Le Super de Beaucaire is notable for the vehemence of its attacks on Paoli. Paoli, too, hoisted the tricolour in Corsica in order to give himself time to deceive the people, to crush the true friends of liberty, and in order to drag his compatriots with him in his ambitious and criminal plots. He hoisted the tricolour and had the ships of the Republic fired at. He had our troops expelled from the fortresses, and he disarmed those who remained. He ravaged and confiscated the property of the richer families because they were allied to the unity of the Republic, and all those who remained in our armies he declared enemies of the nation. He had already caused the failure of the Sardinian expedition, yet he had the impudence to call himself the friend of France and a good Republican. Le Super de Beaucaire was published as a pamphlet at the urging of Salisti, who saw that Napoleon had the makings of a propagandist of genius. He in turn brought it to the notice of Augustin Robespierre, brother of the leader of the new 12-man executive in Paris, the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre thought the work brilliant and was equally impressed by the author when he met him soon afterwards. A great advance in point of style, economy and lucidity over his earlier literary efforts, it shows Napoleon to be extremely well informed on the political and military issues of the day, and is the first time we see the 72 ideas of the mature Napoleon clearly on display. All of Napoleon is to be found in the Super de Beaucaire, Jean Chillard wrote, and perhaps too much is on show. For as first consul, Napoleon ordered the police to destroy every copy they could lay hands on. The immediate result of this successful foray into political propaganda was to encourage Salisti, now a political commissar of enormous power, to wrap the Bonaparte family even closer around him. He began by fixing Joseph's appointment as an assistant commissary of the Republic, attached to the Army of the South on a salary of 6,000 francs. He then kept a close eye on Napoleon, who led an itinerant life for the next weeks. He was at Aries at the beginning of August, then traveled up to Valence and at the beginning of September was back in Auxonne. It was mid-September before Salisti got his chance to reward the most valuable of the Bonapartes. Back in Marseille on the 15th of September, Napoleon was assigned to the escort of powder wagons from Marseille to Nice, ready for use by the French army of Italy. Learning of this, Salisti set it up that Napoleon should stop at Beausset to pay his respects to him and the other deputy in mission, Gasperin, also a Bonaparte supporter. He then introduced the young Bonaparte to General Cardo, who was conducting the siege of Toulon, and suggested him as a replacement for the artillery commander Dammartin, who had been seriously wounded. Cardo was reluctant, but as political commissar Salisti had superior hire and fire powers even to a commander-in-chief, and so the appointment was made. When the men of Toulon admitted the Anglo-Spanish fleet on the night of 28 August 1793, they brought about a potentially critical situation for the Jacobins. Toulon was the most important naval arsenal in France and the key to French control of the Mediterranean. Even more importantly, it posed a problem of credibility for the Montagnards. Not only did its loss damage the image and reputation of the Republic, but it was looked on as a test case. If not recovered, it could fan the flames of the Vendée into wholesale civil war. It was fortunate for the revolutionaries that England had already committed most of its troops to the West Indies, and that no more than 2,000 of them landed at Toulon. 6,000 Austrian soldiers were promised as reinforcements, but never arrived, thus leaving 7,000 poor-quality Neapolitans and 6,000 lackluster Spaniards to bear the brunt of defense. General Cardo had been given 2,000 men to retake Toulon, plus 5,000 detached from the army of Italy under General Lapoip. Both commanders were basically non-entities, who commenced an unimaginative blockade of Toulon, with Lapoip approaching from Hyères and the 73 East and Cardo from the west. The two generals immediately fell foul of their energetic young artillery officer who, with Salisti's endorsement, wrote to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris to denounce their incompetence. The response from Paris was a good sign of the favorable position Napoleon now occupied. He was promoted major with effect from 8 October. Napoleon complained that he could not get Cardo to appreciate the importance of big guns, and he himself lacked the clout to force through what needed to be done. As was the case with all Napoleon's memoranda at this time, it received the endorsement of both political commissars and of Augustin Robespierre. The result of Napoleon's complaint was therefore predictably favorable. Salisti and Gasperin appointed Brigadier Dutheil. Since he was ill and elderly and anyway a patron of Major Bonaparte, Napoleon virtually had a free hand on artillery matters during the siege. During his time on the island, Napoleon had made a close study of Corsican ports and their fortifications, and had even sent a report to the convention. Having gone over the topography of Ajaccio with a fine-tooth comb, he was immediately struck by the remarkable similarity in the geography of Toulon and Ajaccio. This enabled him to zero in on Toulon's weak spot, Fort de Galette, commanding the western promontory between the inner and outer harbor, whose capture would make both harbors untenable by the enemy fleet. "Take La Galette," he wrote to Cardo, "and within a week you are in Toulon." Yet even with the backing of the two commissars, Napoleon found it difficult to persuade Cardo, who believed in crude frontal attacks with the bayonet. If given the green light, Napoleon could have taken La Galette almost instantly, but Cardo's dithering gave the British time to identify the weak spot and fortify it. Napoleon had to settle in for a long haul. He started by making the artillery arm as strong as possible, drawing in cannon from as far away as Antibes and Monaco. With a battery of 136-pounder, 4 24-pounders and a 12-pound mortar, he forced the Royal Navy to keep its distance. Seeing the looming threat, the British made several sorties and fought tenaciously. Meanwhile, a political battle developed in tandem with the military one, as Napoleon kept plugging away to Salisti and Gasperin on the theme of Cardo's incompetence. The Chinese whispers against the official commander reached the point where Cardo's wife is said to have advised him to give Napoleon his head. The best thing was to distance himself, just in case the young major failed, but if he succeeded, Cardo himself could take the credit. Fortunately, on the 23rd of October the commissar's negative reports finally had their effect, and Cardo was posted away to take command of the Army 74 of Italy. Another timid commander, General Doppet, a former dentist who allegedly could not stand the sight of blood, came and went within 3 weeks. Finally, on the 17th of November, Napoleon got a commander after his own heart in the shape of General Dugommier. Behind this appointment lay a complex story of politicking in Paris. Salisti found a powerful new ally there in Lazare Carnot, who was the member of the Committee of Public Safety entrusted with the organization and deployment of France's 14 armies. Carnot saw the merit of Napoleon's scheme and overruled the other, inferior, plans that had been put to him. There was no more dithering. "There is only one possible plan, Bonaparte's," Dugommier wrote to the Ministry of War. For all that, Dugommier ordered one final attack across a broad front before bowing to the inevitable. But after a frenzied combat, when the English sordid and bloody hand-to-hand fighting took place, yielding hundreds of casualties on both sides and the expenditure of sous cartridges, he signed the order endorsing Napoleon's scheme. Aiguillette Point was dominated by the fort called Mulgrave, which the French nicknamed Little Gibraltar. Having amassed a powerful artillery park and demonstrated the accuracy of his gunners by shelling British ships, artillery persistently served with red-hot cannonballs is terrible against a fleet. He wrote later, Napoleon began on the 11th of December to bring up his guns to very close range. He made good use of the rolling, hilly terrain to construct new batteries, and then commenced a 48-hour artillery duel with the 20 guns and 4 mortars inside the fort. On the 16th of December, during this softening up process, he narrowly escaped death when he was knocked off his feet by the wind from a passing cannonball. It was at Toulon that Napoleon met the first of his faithful followers. Andrach Junot was then a young sergeant from Burgundy. When Napoleon asked for a volunteer soldier with good handwriting, Junot stepped forward. While Napoleon was dictating, already impressed with the man's calligraphy and spirit, a cannonball from a British warship fell nearby and sprayed Junot's writing paper with sand. "Good," said Junot. "We won't need to blot this page." This was exactly the sort of humor Napoleon appreciated, and he immediately appointed Junot to his personal staff. By 7 December, Napoleon judged that he had effectively silenced the fusillade from the fort and called on Dugommier to deliver the final attack. Heavy rainfall and low clouds that evening almost led the general to call it off, since the weather would affect the accuracy of musketry by troops whom he knew not to be top flight. But this raised suspicions in 75 the political commissars that Dugommier's heart was not in the job. They toyed with asking Napoleon himself to lead, but he quickly talked Dugommier round into leading an attack by S.O.O. men, arguing that artillery and the bayonet were all that was needed. Advancing in heavy rain and taking heavy casualties, Dugommier's troops hesitated in face of a desperate defense. Then Napoleon led a charge with C.O.O. more troops. Despite having a horse shot from under him, he led his men to the walls. Still taking losses, the French swarmed over the timber-spiked parapets. 2 hours of bitter hand-to-hand fighting ensued, with bayonet and saber playing a greater role than musketry. By 3 a.m. it was all over, and the fort was in French hands. Salisti and Gasperin arrived after the fighting to confer their political imprimatur. They found their favorite, Major Bonaparte, lying wounded on the ground, having taken an English sergeant's pike in his inner left thigh just above the knee. At first there was panic, and it was thought amputation would be necessary to prevent gangrene, but a military surgeon was brought in for a second opinion and pronounced the wound not serious. Ever after, however, Napoleon bore a deep scar. More seriously wounded in the final assault was a man who would loom large in Napoleon's later life, Claude Victor Perrin, the future Marshal Victor. At that time, the 29-year-old Victor outranked Napoleon, being a lieutenant colonel, but after Toulon both men were promoted together to the same rank of brigadier general. Other future marshals to make their mark at Toulon were Marmont, then a 19-year-old captain, and a 23-year-old lieutenant, Louis-Gabriel Suchet. It was at Toulon also that Napoleon first met the greatest of all soldiers whom ever commanded his armies, 25-year-old Louis-Charles de Saix, and the man who would be his greatest friend, 21-year-old Gerard Christophe Duroc. But not all Napoleon's new acquaintances were of high caliber. One, who would soon marry into his family, was the stupid and pretentious blonde-haired Victor Emmanuel Leclerc. Napoleon's prediction about Aiguillette was soon borne out. On the 8th, the British took the decision to abandon Toulon. The 29-year-old English sailor Sidney Smith, already knighted for feats of gallantry, and Hood's right-hand man in Toulon, remarked that troops crowded to the water like the herd of swine that ran furiously into the sea possessed of the devil. Hood and Smith set fire to the military arsenal and gutted all the ships they could not use, then put to sea under cover of darkness. The terrific explosion when the arsenal finally blew up at 9 p.m. 76 that evening made a great impression on Napoleon's romantic soul. The French began to enter Toulon next day. Toulon was a great triumph for Napoleon's nascent military genius, but it was marred by wholesale massacre once the French armies got inside the city. The surrender of Toulon to the British had given the Committee of Public Safety a terrible fright, and they reacted with the vengeful reflex common on such occasions. The mass executions began on the 20th of December, 200 officers and men of the naval artillery, then another 200 collaborators the next day. A Jacobin official named Fouch, later to be heard from, put forward a pilot version of General Franco's infamous 20th-century credo of redemption through bloodshed. "We are shedding much blood, but for humanity and duty." Napoleon, anxious that his great moment should not be besmirched by hecatombs of blood, and anyway unable to do more than stumble about, largely shut his eyes to what was going on around him. It was anyway an expedient to take notice. Dugommier did so, and was immediately suspected of being an enemy of the people. But black propaganda linking Napoleon with the Toulon massacres can be disregarded. Even if Napoleon's later claim that only the ringleaders were shot is humbug, so too is Sidney Smith's assertion that Bonaparte personally mowed down the innocent in hundreds. Toulon was a significant milestone in Napoleon's career, and he always looked back on it with romantic nostalgia. Anyone who was with him at Toulon could, in later years, be certain of promotions and rewards, even the useless Cardo. It is interesting to note that he had already met many of the people who would loom large in the consular and imperial periods: Desaix, Duroc, Junot, Marmont, Victor, Suchet. Napoleon had now made his reputation among elite circles, even if he was still a long way from being a household name. The political commissars hastened to promote him to brigadier general on the 22nd of December, and this was ratified by the Committee of Public Safety on the 16th of February 1794. Dutel reported to the Ministry of War, "I lack words to convey Bonaparte's merit to you, much knowledge, equal intelligence and too much bravery, that is but a feeble sketch of this rare officer's virtues." Yet Toulon was no guarantee of a glittering future for Napoleon. The political situation was still too uncertain, and too many revolutionary generals had been sacked, shot or guillotined to make Toulon the inevitable prelude to his NSC. After recovering from his wounds, Napoleon was in Marseille until the end of the year, and was then given command of the artillery arm of the 77 Army of Italy, with headquarters at Nice. With his general's pay of Rs. 000 livres a year, a 12-fold increase in income since joining the La Fère regiment 7 years earlier, he was able to install Letizia at the Château Sal, a pretty country house near Antibes set in groves of palm, eucalyptus, mimosa and orange trees. Always down to earth and practical, Letizia impressed the locals by doing her own laundry in a stream that ran through the garden, even though funds were plentiful enough. Napoleon now took stock of his family. Of the younger brothers, so far his favorite was Louis, a bookish 15-year-old. "Louis has just the qualities I like," Napoleon wrote: warmth, good health, talent, precision in his dealings, and kindness. Lucien was mainly antagonistic. He was annoyed that Napoleon had secured Joseph a sinecure with Salisti, but had left him to rot as a commissariat storekeeper in the village of St. Maximin on a pittance of Rs. francs a year, partly out of pique, and to show his independence, Lucien married an illiterate and penniless innkeeper's daughter without even consulting Letizia, so much, he seemed to say, for the Bonaparte pretensions to nobility. Another looming cloud on the family horizon was Napoleon's favorite sister, Pauline, rising 14. Already a stunning creature, who combined beauty with magnetic sex appeal, she was already turning heads and inviting unwelcome attention. Andrach Junot, promoted to lieutenant for his feats at Toulon, was one of those bowled over when he accompanied his general on a visit to Château Sal. The one success in the family, Napoleon apart, seemed to be Joseph. In Marseille lived a rich merchant in the silk, soap and textiles trade named Frank Oise Clary, a man with royalist sympathies. In the troubles of 1793 Clary backed the wrong horse, and, when Marseille fell to government troops, had the Jacobin firebrand Stanislas Fréron on his neck. One of Clary's sons was thrown into jail and the other committed suicide to avoid a firing squad. Broken by grief and anxiety, Frank Oise Clary pined away and died. His widow came to Salisti to petition for her son Etienne's release and to lift the anathema of counter-revolutionary running dogs that had fallen on the family. At Salisti she met Joseph, charmed him and invited him to dine. There he met the elder daughter Julie Clary, aged 22, and, learning that she was to inherit 80,000 francs once her father's will was settled, promptly issued a certificate, exonerating the family of all royalist sympathies. Out of gratitude, Julie agreed to be his wife, and a wedding date was fixed for August 1794. After a short spell as inspector of coastal fortifications between 78 Marseille and Toulon, while he waited for the ratification of his new appointment to come through, Napoleon moved to Nice, with the faithful Junot in tow, to take up his post as senior gunner in the Army of Italy. Until mid-July 1794 he was to be found commuting from Nice westwards to Antibes, and Fréjus and eastward to San Remo and Ventimiglia, tirelessly working on new military schemes and confirming the battle readiness of his units. After 2 years of warfare against Austria, the Army of Italy was stalemated in a fruitless campaign against Piedmont, which was being constantly rearmed, reinforced, supplied and sustained by the British Navy operating through Genoa. Napoleon began by writing up a stratagem for capturing Wanglia. When this fell, on the 9th of April 1794, his reputation was sky-high and he was asked to write a general memorandum on grand strategy. Basing his strategy on the writings of Guibert de Burset, Napoleon devised a plan that enabled the army of Italy to advance to the watershed of the Maritime Alps, having secured control of the passes of Col d'Argentière, Tende and Saint Bernard. With the enthusiastic support of Augustin Robespierre, who took Bonaparte's memorandum to Paris with him, Napoleon argued that if the French attacked in Piedmont, Austria would be forced to come to the aid of her Austrian possessions, and thus weaken her position on the Rhine, allowing the French to strike a knockout blow there. Napoleon's chances of getting the plan accepted looked good, for his new commander-in-chief, General Dumouriez, deferred in all things to the political commissars. Salisti and Augustin Robespierre, in turn, nodded through anything military that came from the pen of Napoleon. The one obstacle to the implementation of Napoleon's plans was Carnot in Paris. Carnot argued instead for an invasion of Spain, in the teeth of the explicit advice in the Bonaparte Memorandum that Spain was too tough a nut to crack. Ironically, advice Napoleon himself was to ignore later in his career. But Carnot was adamant that the Piedmont venture would not proceed. There are even some historians who argue that the fervent advocacy of the Italian invasion by the Robespierre brothers was what turned Carnot against them and sealed their fate. The famous Thermidorian reaction of the 27th of July 1794, which brought the Robespierre brothers and the Jacobin leaders to the guillotine, was the end of the French Revolution in all but name. After 3 years in which the left had ruled the roost in Paris, it was now the turn of the right. As a committed Jacobin and friend of Augustin Robespierre, Napoleon was in danger. It has sometimes been suggested that he was not really in deadly peril from the ideological point of view. 79 For he was perceived in Paris as a military technician par excellence, and in the very month of Thermidor had become a general-elect and sworn an oath to the revolution itself. That may be true in a general sense, but unfortunately for him, at the very moment of Thermidor, Napoleon found himself in a compromising situation through having undertaken a secret mission to Genoa. There was really no great mystery about this visit. Napoleon was authorized to go to Genoa by Ricord, one of the political commissars, as part of the general scheme for preparing a counterstroke against Austria and Piedmont. But it was unfortunate that just before he went he fell out with Salisti. The reasons are obscure, but there was a persistent rumor that they had been rivals for the favors of the same girl in Nice. Annoyed by Napoleon's refusal to leave the amatory field clear for him, after all he had done for the Bonapartes, Salisti also had to save his own skin after Thermidor, so came forward to denounce the chief of artillery. Salisti now claimed that Napoleon had gone to Genoa on secret instructions from the Robespierres to hatch a contingency plan with the enemy to be activated in case the brothers fell from power. In his letter to the Committee of Public Safety on the 6th of August, Salisti spoke of dark deeds, including the deposit of French gold in a Genoese bank account. The accusation was preposterous, but in the feverish, paranoid atmosphere after Thermidor anything was believed possible. On the 10th of August Napoleon was placed under house arrest at his residence in the Rue de Villefranche in Nice, and later lodged either in the prison of Fort Car in Antibes or under house arrest with Comte Laurenti in Nice. Incredibly, the record is confused, with evidence pointing either way, and partisans for one or other view claiming that the documentation supporting the rival view is forged. His papers were seized and sent to Salisti for examination, and Lucien Bonaparte was arrested as an accomplice. The different attitudes of the two brothers are instructive. Lucien groveled, debased himself and asked for mercy. Napoleon wrote a dignified rebuttal, rehearsing his services to the Republic and his exploits at Toulon. In confinement he showed himself an optimist by reading and taking notes on Marshal Maillebois' account of his campaign in Piedmont in 1745, but in his heart he thought his number was up, and discussed with Junot plots to spring him from captivity. Suddenly, on the 20th of August, Salisti and his fellow commissars announced that Napoleon's papers and his meticulous accounts completely vindicated him. The explanation for Salisti's volte-face was that he realized the men of Thermidor were not calling for extensive blood sacrifices, and that he himself was in the clear. Executing Napoleon was a pointless indulgence for, in Salisti's view, there was still political mileage to be made out of exploiting his military talent. To his credit, Salisti urged that Napoleon's continuing presence at the front was necessary if the army of Italy was to succeed. Even before Salisti had his change of mind, General Dumouriez had been telling the deputies and mission and the War Ministry that he could not afford to lose an officer of Bonaparte's caliber. Once restored to the army, Napoleon continued to submit memoranda on his Piedmontese project, this time dealing with a threatened Anglo-Piedmontese assault on French-held Savona. But Carnot, firmly in the saddle after Thermidor, rejected his ideas even more forthrightly than before. Not even Dumouriez's victory against the Austrians at the First Battle of Dago could shake him. Nevertheless, Dumouriez sent envoys to Paris to plead for a general offensive in Italy, and wrote that the military achievements of 1794 were entirely due to Bonaparte. It is to the ability of the general of artillery that I owe the clever combinations which have secured our success. The most Carnot would do was to hold out hopes of an expedition against Corsica. From December 1794 to February 1795, therefore, Napoleon was in Nice, Marseille and Toulon, preparing an expedition that he would never take part in. 1794 saw some significant developments in the Bonaparte family dynamic, and in Napoleon's personal circumstances. In August Joseph married Julie Clary, but Napoleon was still in Genoa and could not attend the wedding. If his older brother had secured his position by marrying money, Louis seemed to be faring much better than the cross-grained Lucian. Napoleon appointed Louis to his staff, and the young man saw action against the Piedmontese in the Alps before being posted to a coastal battery at Saint-Tropez. Napoleon himself, after a long period apparently in limbo, rediscovered his sexuality. Soon after the flight from Corsica there was another encounter with a prostitute, this time in the stews of Toulon, from which Napoleon emerged complaining of the itch. The evidence is tenuous, but he seems to have scratched and torn at his skin, eventually bringing on eczema. There was a heavy flirtation, at the very least, with Emily, daughter of the Comte de Laurenti, in Nice, just before his arrest. It is also certain that on the 21st of September 1794 he made the acquaintance of M. Turreau de Lignières, yet another political commissar, and his charming and vivacious wife, that he carried on a heavy flirtation with Madame, and may even have made her his mistress. Certainly he had intercourse with her either in 1794 or 1795, and there were even rumors that he fathered 81 a child on her. He later numbered her among his conquests and confessed sheepishly that he had needlessly sacrificed the lives of some of his men in a futile attack on an enemy position on the Italian front simply to show off to her. There seems an element of fantasy about this ill-documented affair which, however, Frederick Masson accepts as a genuine liaison. Perhaps the true fantasy, as the psychoanalyst Ernest Jones suggested, was not the affair, which was real enough, but the sacrifice of the men. A psychoanalytical reading of the business with Mme de Lignières would suggest that the words Napoleon uses to describe the alleged incident some men were left on the field of battle could refer to the husbands he had cuckolded. Napoleon's confession might therefore be the Sartrean ploy of pleading guilty to a lesser misdemeanor. In Napoleon's confused mind the loss of soldiers might weigh less than the sin of adultery about which he always had such strong feelings. The year 1794 certainly ended Napoleon's flirtation with Jacobinism and other forms of political radicalism. The Thermidorian reaction meant that landowners and men of property were entrenched as the true beneficiaries of the revolution, and that there would be no further pandering to the sans-culottes or other dispossessed groups. This hard line by Carnot and his colleagues, together with the famines, harvest failures, unemployment and price rises, for after Robespierre's fall there was a year of chaos with depreciating assignats, unpaid armies and therefore zero recruitment, brought the old revolutionaries out on the streets again. The crowd stormed the convention on I-2 Germinal Year 3, and were dispersed by the National Guard. They tried again on I-Prairial and were again dispersed by the Guard. But the heart had gone out of the revolutionary crowd. These manifestations lacked the zeal and organization of previous post-1789 insurrections and were more like the old-fashioned ancient regime-bred riots. Put down ruthlessly, these street revolts proved to be the last hurrah of the revolutionary crowd, which was not seen in action again until after the Napoleonic era. The Thermidorian defense of property meant most of all the defense of new property. For the men of Thermidor, the profiteers, hoarders, black marketeers, speculators in military supplies or the falling assignats, were the true beneficiaries of the revolution. Most of all, the new class was made up of those who had cornered large public monopolies, or who had purchased what was euphemistically called national property, in other words, confiscated church lands or real estate previously belonging to exiled aristocrats. The Thermidorian alliance of the bourgeoisie with the upper peasantry gave Napoleon a valuable lesson in political 82 management. Quite apart from the fact that the executive was now chock full of regicides, he saw clearly that their economic interests precluded a return to the ancient regime as surely as the angel barring the return to Eden. This meant that a man could make himself a kind of king without fear of competition from the Bourbons. Napoleon's ready abandonment of his old friends, the Robespierres, has seemed to some of his critics the most cynical form of realpolitik. He distanced himself from the executed leader in a letter to Tilly on the 7th of August 1794, and this explanation has often been condemned as skin-saving double-talk. I have been somewhat moved by the catastrophe of the younger Robespierre whom I loved, and whom I believed to be pure, but were he my brother, I would have stabbed him with my own hand had he aspired to tyranny. Yet there may be more to it than simple expediency. At the deepest level Napoleon and Maximilien Robespierre, the sea-green incorruptible, would always have made unlikely bedfellows. It is true that some superficial similarities can be pointed to. Both had difficult childhoods, both were proud and aloof, both romantic dreamers. But where Robespierre genuinely did dream of a utopia of perfect equality, the non-existence of poverty, the triumph of morality and Rousseau's general will, Napoleon never paid more than lip service to those ideals. At bottom, Napoleon's heart was with the ancient regime, with its patterns of hierarchy and order. He was a meritocrat, not an egalitarian. His quarrel with the pre-1789 world was that talent was not hailed as the supreme value, over birth and inherited wealth. Thermidor ushered in a kind of crude entrepreneurial meritocracy, where the craftiest, the most cunning, the most corrupt and the most manipulative were preferred to the old aristocracy, or the new would-be levelers. There was another deep psychological factor making it easy for Napoleon to switch horses from Robespierre and Jacobinism to Carnot and the Thermidorians. The core of Robespierre's thought was Rousseau, but Napoleon was already turning his back on Rousseau long before the 27th of July 1794. The reason is obvious. Rousseau was associated in his mind with Corsica and with Paoli. Once he allowed his hatred for native island and father figure to come gushing out of its subterranean caverns, it was obvious that Rousseau would be the next to go. Once again, as so often in Napoleon's life, a dramatic event, in this case the fall of Robespierre, crystallized a process that was already underway in his mind.